Thank you for joining us today for our annual Words the Orangeville Way literary event. We host this event annually in partnership with Orangeville's independent bookstore, Booklore. My name is Lauren Tilley, and I am the Program and Research Librarian at the Orangeville Public Library. Today we are featuring two local residents, Suzanne Hillier and Helen Walsh, who are going to discuss their latest works, My Best Friend Was Angela Bennett and Pull Focus. Each of these books include powerful themes and strong female characters. In Canada, October is Women's History Month, and November marks Women Abuse Prevention Month, which frames today's event well as we continue the important work of having conversations, which can be difficult at times, that explore the experience of women. The two books that are being highlighted here today explore the trials and tribulations faced by their female characters, including sexual harassment, the Me Too movement, domestic violence, and women's rights, which translates to the real lived experiences of women, both past and present. Therefore, I will advise our viewers at home that some of today's conversation may touch on difficult or traumatic subject matter and could be a trigger for some. That being said, it is our goal here today to have a thoughtful and engaging discussion, and here to help us do that is local independent writer Bernadette Hardaker.
Good afternoon to our friends who are watching online and to our fabulous authors, Suzanne Hillier and Helen Walsh. Thank you so much for joining us. What I like to do when I have this opportunity with authors is ask them to set up their story, because you know your story better than anyone. So Helen, would you introduce us to your strong female character, Jane Browning, and put her in the story for us?
Sure. Thanks so much, Bernadette, and lovely to be here with Suzanne as well, whose book I very much enjoyed. So Jane is 39 years old. She has, just 3 months before the book opens, been suddenly elevated from artistic director to the acting CEO of the Worldwide Toronto Film Festival. And it's a bit of a poison chalice. Her predecessor has been suspended pending investigation into a sexual harassment scandal that has rocked the organization. The women involved that are alleging this behavior are all staff, and so it has divided the organization, as these things do. And so Jane is catapulted into the role. The book opens, and on opening night of a festival, it covers 10 days of the festival, so 2 chapters per day. And on opening night, in the midst of dealing with an organization that's in tumult, a fight with her new board chair, who's a conservative political backroom fixer, who has it out for her, her partner disappears. And so that sets up the tension of the book. She is forced to deal with the internal stuff, all the drama that happens within a festival. So sponsorship issues, a director who's charged with sexual assault during the festival, at the same time search for her partner Bob, and all of the secrets that his disappearance entails.
Whoa. It's certainly a full cast. I must say that I had to keep notes, who's who, but it works really well.
Thank you.
Suzanne, will you introduce us to Dot? She's your protagonist in your book, Dorothy.
Well, remember, my book starts in 1942, and things were very, very different, and no woman would have been in charge of the film festival in those days. Dot was a bit of a blue stocking, a bit of an intellectual, and there are 2 women here, and they're so opposing in character. Angie, who is Angela Bennett, is your traditional woman, really. Glorious voice. She could have had a career, but she falls very much in love at age 17. And never gets over it, really, in spite of the war, and because of the war, actually, she doesn't get over it. Dot, on the other hand, has a father who's a lawyer, and he wanted a boy, and she did her best, and he has been encouraging to her, And then when she goes to university, she meets a chap who's had his knee blown off in Normandy, and he also encourages her. So she goes to law school and meets some very daunting problems, including the birth of twins before her 3rd year. And it's a case of a woman adjusting in a man's world and being the first lady lawyer in St. John's. And I was one of the first here in Ontario, and we weren't exactly welcomed with open arms. And Dottie has her problems, and this book deals with that. And some of it's very funny, and unless I guess you're Dottie, and in court. But she is a very strong woman, and she does prevail, and not without some guilt and some worries, but she does prevail. So it is a story of a strong woman who prevails and one who really is destroyed. So that is really the essence of the book.
Suzanne, do you want to read us a few excerpts to take us into the story?
Sure.
Into that world of Dottie and Angie?
Yeah.
And we're talking, what, 1942, St. John's?
Yes, St. John's. And it is the war, but in August everything changed. Mothers and wives received telegrams and saw notices in the daily papers. They sat looking into space and then collapsed into months of tears. There were 3,367 casualties and 916 Canadians dead. Many of them, our boys, slaughtered at Dieppe. No one wanted to believe it, and there was sorrow filled with anger. But our boys were gone, and they weren't coming back. The red streetcars clanged over the cobblestones along Water Street, full of gray-faced, tight-lipped, red-eyed women, women whose sons and husbands had disappeared. So that is really the background of this book. It's a war story to some extent. And the Angie, who falls in love forever with Danny Flaherty, who's not up to par when it comes to her family. He's a boy from the railway houses, and he enlists at age 18. "I've joined up," interrupted Danny, "enlisted in the Royal Canadian Navy. And now maybe I'll be less of a maggot to Angie's mother. It'll be like putting lipstick on a cod." I sat stupefied. Were they forgetting Dieppe? Danny was just 3 months past 18. Of course, I'm taking for granted that I'll be getting out. I watched him move restlessly on the wooden seat of the booth. He did realize the danger, but I don't believe Angie did. She was not strong on reality. Angie, although I noticed her giving Danny an occasional anxious glance. And then, of course, Danny does join up, and the inevitable happens. And it's something that Angie does not get over, but ends up marrying the boy next door, who's not really the boy next door. He's a sexual sadist, and he's dreadful, and maybe I went a bit far with the abuse, but this is poor Angie's fate, meeting Edgar Clark. On the other hand, we have the stronger Dottie, who does go to law school. In September 1946, Wills and I were admitted to Dalhousie Law School. I was the only woman in a class of 50 men. I want you to remember, gentlemen, that there is now a lady in our midst. Professor, I would caution you to watch your language at all times. This actually happened to me at U of T, and I think I had probably the biggest potty mouth in the class, but there was a caution, as I recall. There were 5 girls and 150 students, and the professor did caution the boys about their language. Professor Dryden had authored the well-known, respected Dryden on Contracts, but he had taught at the university for 15 years. There were general snickers around the class, and I felt my face burn. Next to me, Wills was shaking in his seat with barely contained laughter. So I hissed and kicked him as hard as I could on his good leg. "She's a Newfoundlander," croaked a voice from the back. Am I to surmise that this disentitles her to the label of lady? Scolded Dryden. And am I to conclude that Newfoundland women tolerate swearing? This produced another, even louder snicker from my male colleagues. And right at the end, we have Dottie prevailing and representing some of the downtrodden women of St. John's. And I would think, Your Honor, the fact that Mrs. Heaney is unemployed, has never worked, and has never finished high school is relevant. All the children are with her with Mr. Heaney's consent, and they are currently sharing one bedroom in the home of Mrs. Heaney's mother. And great importance must be given to the fact she's received no child or spousal support, contrary to an order. Also, I suggest these factors should weigh against a sale. Mrs. Campbell is giving evidence, crooned Gillingham. I suggest, interceded Judge Henry, that the relevant factor may be violence. I have heard no mention of violence. Mrs. Heaney, who will be giving evidence, will inform the court that Mr. Heaney, who has a problem with alcohol, has on 2 occasions thrown her naked into a snowbank in front of the family home. She was forced to go to a neighbor for help. A very humiliating experience. Judge Henry closed his eyes, as if suddenly exposed to a blinding ethereal light. And chilly as well, he murmured with a smile. Do you wish to comment, Mr. Gillingham? So we have, she is prevailing and trying to prevail. And at the end of it, of this, production, Maura Heenley was a nervous wreck. That judge hates you, she said in a hoarse whisper, and he and that bastard lawyer Jerry's are buddies. I can tell. I hate him too, I answered. That don't help me, she retorted, quite sensibly.
Thank you, Suzanne.
So these things happen.
Well, we have lots to explore there. Thank you for setting us up like that. That was great. Helen, would you do us the honors, please?
Sure.
Yes, and I know you had trouble finding an appropriate passage to read.
Well, the film industry is not without a lot of swearing, so it did take me a little bit, but I think I'll start off the top and then read a little bit further into it. So the book opens on opening night of the festival. It starts in the day behind the scenes at the festival with Jane and this board chair that she has so many problems with, and they are discussing a sponsorship that's been quite controversial. Jane wanted to have one Chinese film for opening night, but her predecessor and the board have agreed to a sponsorship underwritten by the Chinese government that came with it strings of censorship on what could be shown and what couldn't be shown. So the compromise is a very sterile film made by Americans about the Chinese. So Chapter 1, Day 1, Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. Every day there's a subtitle of a film. The film and analogies from the film world and from cinema are throughout the book. T-minus 4 hours. I glanced nervously at the wall clock behind Jacob as words slithered out between his thin lips, one coiled phrase after another. He'd cast himself in the character of Dark Messiah. That much was evident in the words he used, the condescending politeness, the pained expression when someone disagreed. Mere civilians might cringe mid-apocalypse, but he'd stay on the horse, semi-automatic rifle in one hand, and the burden of seeing the world for its shitbucket self curled up in the scarred palm of the other. The baddies would quake, the babies would live, and if there were collateral damage of the slow-moving who couldn't get out of the way, whoever said life was fair was a loser anyhow. Jacob Reid owned a successful crisis management firm, BFA, that made problems go away for people rich enough to buy salvation. He'd been recruited as board director of the Worldwide Toronto Film Festival the previous year because his client base brimmed with political leaders and sponsorship-rich corporations. Many of the festival's multi-year funding commitments were due to expire in the near term, and cultivating powerful decision-makers of the kind that owned Jacob a favor, the reasoning went, would have significant upside for the festival. I'd had little functional connection with him until 6 months earlier, when Paul Delgrado, the festival's former CEO, was suspended amid allegations of sexual wrongdoing, and the board chair abruptly resigned. Suddenly, I pole vaulted from artistic director to acting CEO, and Jacob became my board chair. The organization was in crisis, and the board didn't have to look further than one of its own directors for a seasoned pro in the reputational wars. So I'll skip a little bit forward to just as Jane is getting ready to go out and introduce the opening night film, just to give a sense of what the festival is like behind the scenes. A retaliatory pinch at my waist, Tassio, the dresser, was not best pleased. "Put the phone down. You're ruining the line." "I think we're good." "We're not," he said. Fingers reached under the dress to adjust the spandex underclothing I'd been warned against calling a girdle in public. Their brand people hated that, pulling the nylon edges away from the curves of my buttocks so that it became a de facto thong. I dialed Bob, Bob's her partner, and it went straight to voicemail. Tassio yanked the phone away, tossing it over the top of the privacy screen to Samantha, who slipped it into her purse. She disappeared only to re-emerge seconds later, accompanied by a tuxedo-clad, gray-haired man who was 70 if he was a day. "This is Gerald. He's one of the volunteers this year. He'll be honored to be your escort for this evening." "Pardon?" "Gerald can move when Bob shows up, but we're 15 minutes late and we can't hold any longer," Samantha said, reading my mind. "I'm 4 inches taller than him." I was dismayed to hear a slight whine infect my tone. Bert pulled up alongside Samantha. Samantha's her assistant. "The fat man's in position. Producers are getting itchy to start in case he hoofs it," he said. Fat Man Rising, a hashtag started by a festival staffer to track famed distributor Larry Ross' movements without identifying him directly, had gone viral. Within a minute, had become the litmus test for whether someone was a festival insider. Unsquelchable. I had turned it over to Lena and the marketing department to discreetly exploit. So then we go a little bit further into, and this is just the end of chapter 1, the opening night film, which is called Shifting Dragon. This is a screening. A guttural sound from the balcony competed with the applause. All heads, including mine, swiveled to witness Devlin Ross, she's the main actress, stumble her way across a seated Huntley Bartlett, supporting actor in Shifting Dragon, who hadn't thought fast enough to get up. She milked his lack of chivalry for every ounce of attention she could get, prolonging and exaggerating her teeter. Her co-star, Andy C., stood and extended his hand to assist, causing rows of young women to swoon in delicious delight. Twitter had been vicious about Huntley's performance after a rough cut of the film leaked. Hoping to extinguish the negative momentum, the film's production company ordered Huntley to skip the festival, offering an escalating non-appearance bonus. But his agent had hung tough, labeling it an infringement on Huntley's First Amendment rights. Huntley would go where Huntley wanted to go, and neither God nor goddamn Beijing was going to interfere. Taking pity on Huntley, I began to thank the long list of sponsors, forcing attention back to the stage. Finally, I headed back to my seat, but paused in consternation at the end of the aisle. Avatar Bob had melted away as imperceptibly as the real one, replaced by a woman I didn't know. Small, curvaceous, and with carefully sculpted blonde hair, she seemed exuberant, if that's not too strange a description for somebody who is not uttering a word. A life force so strong, she seemed to be in full motion when not even moving an inch. It was possible to take my eyes off her, and I didn't even try. She whispered in my ear the second I sat down, "The tsunami is coming. It's urgent we speak about Bob." And that's the end of chapter 1.
Whoa. Helen, you describe yourself as festival mad. That, and I mean, I know you were actually an artistic director of a festival for years, and you're many years with the Literary Review of Canada. But, I mean, were you writing as much from your own personal experience, or is this, just fabulous research that you've done to pull this book off?
Well, a little bit of both. Look at you and I'll look there.
Oh, yeah.
A little bit of both. I mean, certainly from being both a film producer and a festival director, that sense of high stakes, of momentum, of never sleeping, about all the stresses, the money at stake, and also just the eccentric personalities, right? There's lots of big personalities. It's all escalated every minute of the day. So that, both being a producer and being a director, is in the book, and that's the pace of the book. And certainly all the people, as you said, it's a full cast of characters. There's Russian oligarchs, there's Chinese propagandists, there's spies, there's a lot of people in this book. There's, sexual predators, there's lots of Hollywood people, really. So it's partly that, but it is true that I'm also festival mad. I do spend August every year in Edinburgh for the festivals. I go to Hay. I go to a lot of literary festivals. I'm off to Sundance next month. So it's been both a combination of professional and personal. And it's just a compelling world. So that's.
So was it easy to write? Was it easy to just put yourself into that world because you're familiar with it?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say. Yeah, it was a natural way to. It was a natural world for me to be in. The world, it was easy to create. What was hard just was the blending of all of the plot points. Right. As you said, there's a lot of plot points. And that blend of the personal and the professional storylines, so that would go back and forth. It took me 7 drafts to get that in. And every time I did one, I wrote more in, so that became a bit more difficult. But the world itself was very familiar to me.
Well, one of the things I thought was interesting was Jane's parallel world of sort of high finance, in the family corporation, and then you diving into the Kazakhstan oil leases, and I thought, where the heck did that come from? I mean, do you read Forbes and and the Financial Post as well?
Well, I do, and I did actually study economics before English Lit at university, but it was because for a decade I belonged to a research group at U of T that was focused on the G8, G20, and global governance. So I used to go to the G8 summits, the G20 summits, the World Trade meetings. I met Putin in Russia. So that, I met a lot of oligarchs. So that all stuff came from my personal experiences, but also my interest in geopolitics. And that Kazakhstan oil leases all comes from first-hand experience. Yeah, so in and of itself, there was that was easy to write. Though I did interview an anti-money laundering expert for this book and the follow-up book a few times to help with some storyline stuff.
Interesting. Yeah, that's cool. Suzanne, growing up in Newfoundland, as you did during the Second World War and pre-Confederation, how much are you drawing on that, your own life experience, when you tell us the stories of Angie and Dot?
A great deal. I'll head this way.
Yeah, please do.
A great deal, Bernadette, because I was relatively young, but not so young that I didn't remember the war and everything that happened. And I did incorporate that in the book. And of course, I incorporated practicing law in the book and being one of the first lady lawyers, and that's what they call them, in Canada, actually, because it just really started. I went to law school in '68, And it would have been much more challenging for my protagonist, Dottie, who went in, I think it was 46. So, you know, the world wasn't really prepared for women to be in a profession at that point. It was that there was a stereotypical woman at home and keeping a home and baking and doing all those things that they're supposed to do in those days. So, but I did experience a great deal of the things in that book, and certainly Newfoundland was the way it was during the war.
So you read so lovely at the very beginning about Danny and Angie and their love, you know, and Danny is, you know, the poor Irish, the Catholic, and Angie is the comfortable middle-class Protestant. You know, and I just wondered if the classism and the religious intolerance that you talk about, do you think that was sort of emblematic of Newfoundland at the time, or was that pretty well something that, you know, was fairly just typical in Canada at the time?
No, I don't think it was typical in Canada. I think it's typical in Newfoundland.
And why? Why would you say that?
Because the Catholic Protestant nonsense was ongoing. I think they've just gotten past it a little. But there was definitely a lot of religious intolerance. And I think that's one of the reasons why there was a very slight edge to the vote for Confederation, because apparently the Archbishop had come out against it. And of course, immediately the Protestant contingent said, "Oh no, we're going to do it. We'll join them. We don't really want to, but we'll join them." And it's a ridiculous situation, and it went on. And there was a parochial school system. Now I think they've changed that. I think there's a public school, and now people are all going together. But there was definitely a dichotomy between the Protestants and Catholics. And in this book, Danny Flaherty comes from a huge family up in some row houses on Craigmiller Avenue, which were known as the railway houses. And Angie comes from a quite staunch middle-class Protestant family. And let's put it this way, Danny was hardly welcomed.
The maggot reference.
That's right. He was a maggot.
Suzanne,
yes.
a big part of the story, a big part that we've really just barely touched on yet, and it's the title, suggests this friendship, this deep, enduring friendship between Dot and Angie. Why was it important for you to show how friendship was challenged by abuse, by the abuse that Angie experienced at Edgar's hand?
Well, these two girls were next door neighbors, and they were extremely close, and they were very opposed in temperament. You know, Angie was a gorgeous little girl with a wonderful voice, who was extremely popular, and you've got Dottie, who was an academic, and who was tall and not terribly attractive, and but they went together. They walked back and forth to school. They exchanged conversations constantly. And when she sees Angie become enraptured with this boy who's socially beneath her, she's extremely concerned, and she feels somewhat alienated. But she does sort of enable everything. And I think when the abuse starts, which of course is with the husband who takes over when Danny is drowned in the war. He's on a convoy, and a torpedo wipes out the whole convoy, and she loses Danny, who she loves terribly, and gets together with this boy across the street or man across the street who's a terrible abuser and jealous and physically abusive, but sexually abusive, really. And she's so ashamed of what she allows to happen, and quite a bit happens, that she doesn't want to confide to Dottie, her best friend. She's ashamed, and she feels that her image will be tainted. So she sort of stays in an awful situation because of this. Of course, remember now, Newfoundland did not have divorce. It wasn't until 1968 that Canada had divorce. The provinces had their own little divorce courts, but Newfoundland didn't have it. So it was a very difficult situation if you wanted to get out of a marriage, and you did have to show violence. And poor Angie could have shown a lot of violence, but it was terribly embarrassing.
We'll come back to that, Suzanne, for sure.
Yeah.
You know, Helen, and I thought was interesting is that, so Jane, now, you know, we've propelled to the future, contemporary time, and Jane, she's smart, and she's strong, and she's successful, yet she, too, is a victim of physical and emotional abuse. I mean, she's bullied by this pastor's son, she's beaten by her ex-husband, she's assaulted by a donor, she's threatened by the chair of her board. I mean, your story is permeated with all kinds of abuse. And, you know, even as you described, she gets the job because of her predecessor's, you know, sexual misconduct, you know. So why was it important for you to have a contemporary character struggle so much with it?
Because I think the lived experience of women hasn't changed as much as we'd like it to. You know, when I read your book, Suzanne, there was so much, especially around the issues of shame, that I recognized in my own book, which is centered in contemporary time. And we see that, you know, certainly in the entertainment world, in Hollywood. We all know the stories of what people have encountered, and not just Hollywood, in our own arts sector, but it's broad. And even look at the numbers of domestic violence that have happened since COVID hit, right? I mean, it's dramatically increased. This is a perennial problem, and it goes to the heart of how women are viewed in society, but also how we're socialized, you know. So in my character, she did grow up in a house that didn't have physical or sexual abuse, but it had intense secrets. And as psychology tells us, that people who grow up in houses that have intense secrets are very private people, and they internalize shame. And once they've internalized shame, it's very, very difficult to break out of that pattern. And so what you do often is that you don't tell people. You know, Angie doesn't tell Dottie, but that's still the same dynamic that happens all these decades later. Mm-hmm. And Jane finds herself in an early marriage that is to a man she doesn't love, like Angie married her second husband, who is abusive. And she gets out pretty quickly, but the dynamic is still there. And then she, you know, 10, 12 years later, she's working in this job, which she gets, again, because of a sexual harassment scandal, which, you know, pick a scandal in the last 2 or 3 years. You know, as Me Too blew the lid off silence and off shame, and women could grapple in a public way what they said to each other privately in a bar, you know, stay away from him, stay away from him. Suddenly we could actually talk about that out loud, and some people are surprised. I don't know why, because I don't think anyway 50% of the population was surprised of the stories that came out. And to me, the blowing the lid off silence is very, very critical to make sure that in 40 years somebody other than Suzanne and I are not still writing stories about sexual harassment and sexual abuse.
So, Suzanne, you know, Edgar is a classic sadist. He is so, and you write pretty explicitly about what he does to mm-hmm. her and what she endures and the incredible injuries that she suffers at his hands. And I really wanted to know, did you hold back when you were writing about him and what she endured, what Angie endured?
Did I go back?
Did you hold back?
Hold back? I don't think I held back enough. I didn't. Oh, my daughter is so disgusted with me. She said, Mother, why did you have to be so explicit? And I did. I think I should have held back more, but I didn't. And it's so ironic that really Angie puts up with this abuse, and it's really when Edgar mistreats their child and tells Dottie what he's been up to, that she decides she has to leave him. It's I think in some way she felt that she deserved some sort of punishment because she married him. She didn't love him. And she brings her love letters on her honeymoon from Danny, and of course he finds them, reads them, and throws them into the ocean, and punishes her, and this keeps on and on. And when I read Jane's book, I thought, you know, the protagonist Jane, what am I saying? Helen's book. Her protagonist had an arm broken and a collarbone broken apparently in her first marriage, and she was still married to him. And
Long separated, I would say.
They're separated. She's living with his brother, stepbrother, which is interesting. I thought that was quite interesting.
A little messy,
Yeah,
perhaps.
Jane is quite something.
But wasn't it interesting, if I could interrupt for a second, wasn't it interesting that when Jane goes hunting for her ex-husband and finds him, that she slips right back into that pattern and is abused years and years later by him again, which I thought was rang so true, because I think what you're describing is a pattern of behavior that women can sometimes find themselves in, that both your characters illustrate so clearly, you know.
Well, I also think silence and shame keeps that playing, you know. When I read your book, you know, the details did shock me. But what shocked me more was, in fact, Dottie's response to Angie, right? Like Angie, because we're in her point of view, you can see why she rationalizes to herself staying, in part because she has no options out. There's no easy options out. But Dottie's initial response to Angie telling her is it comes across as condemnation, right? And she leaves the house. She leaves her in place in danger. And I thought to myself, well, that's why Angie didn't leave. That's why Angie didn't leave, because Dottie was the personification of society at the time. Yeah, her initial response was, how could Angie let this happen to herself? And I thought, but that's what happens to people. That's what happens to women, you know.
But that's what's
I found it fascinating.
That's what was interesting about their friendship, I think, Suzanne, is that Dottie evolved as a person through Angie's pain, because she was angry, she was ashamed for her friend, she didn't even want to know her friend there, you know, really at that point. And I think there's a real redemption in their friendship through the course of the story. I don't want to give too much away, but the way that you know, Angie comes to assist Dottie when she's in law school with her twins, you know, it's kind of a beautiful, you know, redemption for her, because you know, she got to have that child, that perfect child that she never had to have because of her own little boy's infirmities, you know. So there's a lot of complexity in both of these stories, you know, and in the nature of relationships of women with other women. I mean, talk a little bit about Samantha. I thought that was really interesting. Samantha, you know, is Jane's inherited assistant who has tremendous loyalty towards her former boss, who's been charged with sexual, you know, harassment. Talk to us about that relationship between Jane and Samantha.
Yeah, it was an interesting one to write, and I when it came to doing the audiobook version, I met with which comes out in next week, I guess. I met with the director and the actors, and the director had no sympathy for Samantha, like none. She said to me, well, that woman, she set up another woman, and it's true, right? I mean, but that's what happens, right? Our loyalty is not just along gendered lines, and we feel loyal to the people in our lives, the people that we're close to, and half the time they're men. Well, not half the time, but in my character's case, half the time it's a man. So for Samantha, Samantha lived a certain set of rules, right? She went young into the festival world. She worked her way up, in the administration role. She became the head of the chief assistant to the CEO. And in that role, she had power. And that power was in a more traditional support role, which is often the role that was available to women, right? For a long time, anything else was not available to women. And so in that, information was her currency. That was the only power she had, was to control information. All of a sudden, this man with whom she's very close is accused of sexual harassment. She doesn't believe the allegations, which is often what happens. She starts working against the women who have made these allegations. And she's, her boss and her friend is suspended. And now she's working for a younger woman that has trust issues. So she's not, she's a secret woman. She holds information close to her chest. And so Samantha is left without her normal power base. And so her way to get power is to inform on Jane, to be, I don't want to go too much into details, but to try to get the information she can get is her currency to try to keep her job. And so she's scrambling just as much as Jane is scrambling in her own realm.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
I thought that was very interesting, the lack of really a sexual loyalty between women. Males bond. There's bonding. They're off to the golf course together. And women, for the longest time, have not been supportive of each other. And in your book, this Samantha is very highly defensive of Paul, who she's been working for. And he sends out pictures of his genitals to the staff, and she still is protective and defensive. And it's very, very interesting as you see this sort of as women, we are inclined to be defensive if we're close to a male and there's harassment. We're inclined to defend them. And I noticed that was a very interesting aspect in your book, I thought. And there was a growing sense of closeness with Jane and Samantha. There was but I noticed
Détente, I think it was really détente. I really do.
Yeah.
And Helen, the other thing I thought was your kind of villains, the two female villains, who you had a great way of characterizing, like, what do you call them, leopard? You had, Alex was leopard.
The leopard blonde.
The leopard blonde,
Yes.
and then Anna, the oligarch, you had a name for her too, like she was a spy or something.
From the James Bond movie,
I can't remember what it was.
Yeah,
but
I'm hesitant to say it because I know I have it wrong. And it's
I don't
slightly obscene, so
Yeah.
I don't want to get it wrong.
But you're not allowed to get your own book wrong, But what I thought was really cool was there was the moment.
Octopussy. I call her from the James Bond title.
Octopussy, right. So that was interesting was when Anna, the Octopussy, and Jane have their big moment towards the end of the book, and they there's kind of an acquiescence. She stands up to her, and then there's kind of a moment where she says, they agree that the world is not an easy place for their gender, and I love that because there was the gap between them closed instantly, and the commonality between all women that we're all in this together. We've all experienced this. Every single one of us has a story to share, a Me Too story.
Yeah.
And it was the same, even though these two were really on opposite sides.
Yeah, it's interesting. The first time I went to Russia, I was there for an academic conference, and then the G8 summit in St. Petersburg, when Russia was still part of the G8 before they were expelled and it became the G7. And I couldn't get over the first day I walk into this conference, and all of these really serious women, big academics, big government people, they were all in skin-tight clothing, 4-inch heels, a pound of makeup, and perfectly done hair. The rest of us have kind of dragged in, we have a suit on, but we're not femmes, right? Because that's not the role in academe here. And I said to one of them, I followed her to the washroom, and because even then, this was in the end of the 90s, you had to bring your own toilet paper. There was no toilet paper in Russia. You had to bring your own toilet paper, even in the universities, And so and she was putting on her makeup again, and I said, and I couldn't figure out quite how to say it, but I'm kind of going like this, and she's like, yeah, I get it, Helen. But she said, we're such a sexist society that, if I don't do this, I won't get my job. And I said, well, you must get sexual harassed all the time. She's like, you think? But, this is the society in which I live. And it was this kind of bonding moment. Because, when I first saw her, I thought, oh, come on, get over yourself. Here you are. It's 9 o'clock in the morning. And then it was just that moment I thought, yeah, but, this is the world we live in. And some of, each of our societies has a slightly different way of manifesting. But all of it is about power and gender. All of it is about power and gender. And it was that moment, that I was thinking about in that scene.
What I also think is really interesting, as it's explicit, especially in your case, Suzanne, is the abuse is, and it is explicit. You both introduced as counterpoints good men, if I can use that word terms. Angie has her father who she. Dottie has her father, who she adores, who's a strong male figure, and then Willie, the man she marries, who's a great guy, and then Jane hires fabulous men,
She does.
her lawyer and her fabulous bodyguard. Boo. We like
a
him.
little sexual tension.
Yeah, there's a
He
little
was
there's
great.
a little
He was
foreshadowing
lovely.
for the next book, I would say. Yeah,
He's
yes.
in your shower.
Yeah.
He gave her a shower, that's right.
Yeah,
He washed
I said,
her hair.
Yeah. He was very tender, was the word I thought for him. So, I mean, why was it important to have the counterbalance of the good men, if I can put it that way?
No, I love men. You know what I mean? I got a great partner. I got great male friends. I'm not anti-men at all. So I think there are fantastic men out there. And I think we have to, at the same time we say that, we have to recognize that we live in a society that has been traditional and patriarchal and has systems of control, and that the status quo will do whatever it can to defend itself, right? Like the status quo does not like change, whether that's gender or race or whatever it is. It will have its own way if it can. And so I think we have to knock at the door for change. I think there are no gains that have been made that can't be reversed for either race or gender, and that we always have to stand on guard for that.
What I find fascinating about both of you is that this is a first novel, a debut novel, and this is you've written
Yes,
two other books.
This is my second.
Your second, yes.
And the first one, I did a brilliant thing. I bashed Canadian hockey. Can you imagine?
Really sold
Having
well.
a first novel and bashing Canadian hockey.
Oh my
Oh
gosh.
yes, brilliant. And
So-
this time I've got all sorts of sexual sadism, so I have got to smarten up. Obviously.
So I'm getting to is, if you could have done things differently, what would have helped you start writing sooner? Or would that have been something you would have done sooner? Or did you need the lived experience that you've had to get to this point to write?
I would have not worked 65 hours a week. I think that's
Exactly.
it's just time. There's no way. there's no way to write a novel without writing pretty much every day, because especially one with a plot, you can't hold it in your head. You can't hold it in your head, and I would have stopped working so much 10 years earlier.
Well, it's impossible when you have had the type of jobs that you've, so impressively carried out to write.
Look who's talking, Suzanne. I mean,
How many years
I was a divorce
How
lawyer.
many years did you practice law? How many years did you practice law?
32
Okay,
years.
and
come on.
you raised a family at the same time?
Yeah, they would sort of question whether I raised
Or they raised
them.
themselves, okay.
Yeah, well, no, I was terribly permissive, I mean, they did everything they wanted to do. But I was 32 years, and it was impossible to write when you're doing divorce work. It's impossible to do anything else but suffer with the suffering, and you just can't do it. And I did do a novella in the 60s. I always wanted to write, and I sort of did a Nora Ephron, and when I say, here I am spending my whole life suffering with the suffering, and I'd say to myself, well, it's all copy. And that's what Nora used to say, because every experience you see sort of enriches you in a way that you can later on write about it. But it took me a long time, because as soon as I retired, I did nothing but write. I mean, I have work up to here that I've written, and not published, by the way, yet. But I did. That's all I did. But you can't write if you're carrying on a law practice, or I'm sure running a festival. You just can't do it.
So you spent all those years, or you still do mentor writers through your other work, Diaspora Dialogues.
Yes, so I still run an arts organization called Diaspora Dialogues, and it's a literary mentoring organization. But that's a good pairing, right? Because I'm in a community of writers. I'm thinking about writing. I'm talking to people about their manuscripts, and so that all works together. Although I do get up at 5 or 6, and I write for several hours before I switch over. So I am, and I do that 7 days a week. But before, when I wrote the first few drafts of the novel, I was still also publishing the Literary Review of Canada and running a festival. That was in 6 Canadian cities, so I was on a plane all the time. And, it's Canadian arts, you're not doing that for the money, you're just doing it because, let's be clear, but you're doing that because it's intellectually engaging, because you think public discourse like this is important, But it was actually in 2017, and I was producing an event in Winnipeg, and the writer David Layton, who was mentoring me in my novel, coaching me along, and he said, how's the novel coming? And right there in the middle of Portage Place, I broke down in tears, and I said, I'm stuck on the last draft. And the next day I thought, something's got to give. Something's got to give, because, I'm not getting any younger, and I've wanted to be doing this since I was 15 years old, and bleat, bleat, I'm going to do it.
There's no time like
No
the
time
present.
like the present.
Okay. All right. Well, last question, because I think we're getting close to wrap up. I just want you to talk to me about your publishers, because you both are represented by independent publishers. Mm-hmm. And I'd just love to hear a little bit about that experience, getting your publisher and those particular agents for you.
So I'm published by ECW Press, which is now the largest press in Canada. It's the largest independently owned press. They publish about 65 books a year. My experience with them was a very good one. I went deliberately to them. I knew an acquiring editor there who I wanted to be my editor, and I went and asked her to read it first as a friend and to see if it was ready to send out. And she said, I love your book, but I feel like it should be with a big US commercial publisher, and not a Canadian branch plant of a US publisher, but you need to take it to New York. And then to do that, you need an American agent, because there's really, anyway, I won't go too far into the industry weeds, but And so I did it. I cold called 2 or 3 American agents, and they didn't want to hear from me. I was, a Canadian debut writer, and I went to a friend who was a publisher, used to be a publisher, and asked for advice, and she said, if ECW wants your book, you should take it. They are the best. There's lots of good Canadian presses, so I don't want to say that, but just in my experience, they were great. And so I went back to them, and she took it to the editorial board, and they made me an offer. So I didn't submit it to any other publishers, and so I was very happy with the process. But it's a challenge, right? I mean, there is, and I just wrote an op-ed for the Toronto Star about this. There is an infrastructure in place in Canada that supports, that disadvantages debut authors and that disadvantages books that come from Canadian-owned presses. If you look at any best of 2021 lists or any Christmas buying lists, you will see, as I looked again yesterday, 5% of the titles that are recommended are published by Canadian-owned presses. I personally would argue it's a self-defensive. It's part of the Canadian defensiveness that what is Canadian cannot be great, which I disagree with a lot. But anyway, I've been very happy with my press. 60% of ECW's sales are in the U.S. They're very aggressive in the U.S. market, and so they brought my book out in the U.S. and the U.K. So it's been a good experience for me.
Suzanne, you've got about a minute to finish up.
Yes, I had a very sad experience actually. The Luciana, who was running Inanna, died very shortly after she accepted my book. And it was a great tragedy, and she was only in her 60s. And so there was quite a lot of pressure, I think, on everyone. And but it's good that we have these small publishers, because it is difficult if you're Canadian, if you don't have an American agent. And I think it's a great advantage. You can approach small publishers without having an agent. Now, I did have one to go to Inanna, but my first book, I certainly didn't have an agent. And thank goodness for these publishers. Now, mine is very small. They usually produce 20 books a year, and I think ECW is 65, right? Mm-hmm. So it's a smaller publisher, but it's a feminist publisher, you see, so it was very attractive to me for this book, which is a feminist book. And they specialize in LGBTQ and feminism, and it was my choice, the publisher.
Thank you both. This has been really, really interesting. I mean that sincerely, and I feel really blessed to have spent a little bit of time with you, your talent, and I think I speak for our friends out in Zoom land that this has been a great way to spend an hour. And don't be afraid of these books; they are well worth reading. They're accessible as they are in some way difficult, but you'll come away a richer person for reading them. Thank you both.
Thank you so much.
And thank you,
Thanks to
Orangeville
the
Library.
Thank you, and thank you, Bernadette.
And to Booklore.
Thank you everyone for coming today. Thank you to all of our panelists here today as well. It was extremely engaging. And I think it leaves us all with lots to think about, but it also leaves those who may not have read the book wanting to read the book. So they're available here at the library. They're also available at Booklore. Please don't be shy. And I also want to give a special thanks to Nancy Frater from Booklore today, just for bringing this all together and making this happen. Because
Absolutely.
without you, we wouldn't have done this
Here,
today.
here.
So thank you.
Yeah.
Wonderful woman.
And enjoy your afternoon, everyone. Take care.